The order came through at 0612 on a Tuesday, and it was delivered loud enough for the entire runway to hear. Get her off this base. Today. I don't care how you do it. Colonel Harlan Voss stood 20 feet from the medical tent, his jaw tight, his finger pointed at a woman who hadn't flinched once. Olivia Marsh was 29 years old, 5'4", and standing in a uniform still dark with someone else's blood from the night shift. She held a clipboard in one hand and a trauma kit in the other, and she looked at the colonel the way you look at weather. Something to note, not something to fear. Nobody on that runway knew what she'd done before she became a nurse. Nobody knew what she was about to do next. 3 hours later, the base was burning. If this story already has you locked in, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. Fort Calloway sat on the high desert floor of eastern Nevada, ringed by pale mountains and a fence line that stretched farther than most people cared to walk. It was not a glamorous assignment. The base processed military logistics, fuel, medical supplies, equipment transfers, and it did so with the grinding efficiency of a machine that had been running the same way for 30 years. Nobody came to Fort Calloway looking to make a name for themselves. Most people came here to finish out a contract and leave quietly. Olivia Marsh had arrived 6 weeks earlier on a temporary medical duty order. The base's primary physician, Dr. Anselm, had torn his rotator cuff during a training accident, and Calloway needed a trauma-capable nurse to cover the medical bay until a replacement could be arranged. The assignment was supposed to last 4 weeks. It had stretched to 6 because the paperwork for Dr. Anselm's leave kept getting rerouted, and because, though nobody said this plainly, Olivia was very good at her job and the base had noticed. What the base had not noticed, or had not chosen to notice, was everything else about her. She'd shown up with a single duffel bag, a set of trauma certification cards that the duty officer had barely glanced at, and a manner so contained it read as unremarkable. She smiled when spoken to. She answered questions directly. She ate in the cafeteria at off hours when it was quiet, drank black coffee from the machine near the supply depot, and spent her evenings running the perimeter road at a pace that made the younger soldiers glance twice. Specialist Dara Yuen noticed the pace first. Yuen was 23, stationed in logistics, and she ran the same perimeter road 3 nights a week. She'd caught up to Olivia once, tried to make conversation, and realized after about a mile that Olivia was running easy. Not jogging, not warming up, just running. The way some people breathe, automatically, without effort, as if her body had been built for sustained movement over difficult ground. "You a runner?" Yuen had asked. "Used to be," Olivia said. She didn't elaborate. Yuen had let it drop. The medical bay at Fort Calloway was a 12-bed facility with 2 exam rooms, a minor surgery suite, and a storage room that had been converted into a secondary triage area when the facility was understaffed, which was most of the time. Olivia had reorganized the supply shelves in her first week. Not dramatically, just moved things so the most used items were closest to the door. And none of the 3 medics assigned to the bay had objected. They'd started coming to her with questions they might have otherwise taken to Dr. Anselm. She answered them the way a teacher answers a student who's asking the right thing, directly, without condescension, and without making them feel small for not already knowing. Corporal Tomas Herrera, 26, had been working the bay for 8 months. He'd been skeptical of Olivia in the first week, the way people are skeptical of anyone brought in from outside to cover a gap. By the 3rd week, he'd stopped being skeptical and started paying attention. There was something in the way she moved through a room when someone was hurt. Not fast exactly, but purposeful in a way that took up no extra space. She didn't narrate. She didn't ask questions she already knew the answers to. She made decisions, and she moved on. "Where'd you train?" he'd asked her once while they were restocking after a vehicle accident that had brought in 4 soldiers with lacerations and 1 with a hairline fracture in his wrist. "A few places," she said. He'd waited for more. She'd handed him a box of sterile dressings and moved on to the next shelf. The friction with Major Victor Kane began in her 3rd week. Kane ran base logistics, which meant he controlled the movement of supplies in and out of Fort Calloway, and he controlled it with the kind of authority that had calcified into something personal over many years in the same role. He was 44, compact, with the tight-shouldered posture of a man who had once been physically capable and now carried that memory in his body rather than his actual fitness. He had a habit of arriving places before he was expected and leaving before he was asked to go. And he had a way of speaking to people, particularly people he outranked, and particularly women, that stopped just short of open contempt. He came to the medical bay on a Wednesday afternoon in week 3 for a routine supply audit. Olivia was restocking the trauma cabinet when he walked in with a clipboard and a junior clerk, Airman Pell, who looked like he wished he were somewhere else. Kane walked past Olivia without acknowledgement, went to the back storage room, and began checking inventory against his records. After 10 minutes, he came back out and stood in the center of the bay. "You moved things," he said. Olivia looked up. "The supply arrangement wasn't efficient. I reorganized by frequency of use." "This facility's supply arrangement is governed by base logistics protocol." "I'm aware," she said. "The protocol doesn't specify shelf position. It specifies inventory levels." Kane looked at her for a long moment. Airman Pell became extremely interested in his own clipboard. "You're the coverage nurse," Kane said. "Olivia Marsh, yes. You're here temporarily." "That's correct." "Then I'd suggest," he said in a tone that had no suggestion in it, "that you leave the arrangement of this facility to the people who'll still be here when you're gone." He left. Pell gave Olivia a brief, apologetic glance on his way out, and then they were both gone. Herrera came in from the exam room, where he'd been redressing a wound on a private who'd caught a fence wire across his forearm. He'd heard the exchange. He looked at Olivia. "Don't take it personally," he said. "He's like that with everyone." "I didn't take it personally," she said, and went back to the trauma cabinet. The supply movements that caught Olivia's attention started the following week, on a Thursday. She hadn't been looking for anything. She'd put in a requisition for additional IV fluid bags. The base's stock was running lower than it should have been given their patient volume. And when the order came back flagged as pending rerouting, she'd asked Herrera what that meant. "It means it's going through Kane's office," Herrera said. "Why would IV fluids need rerouting?" Herrera shrugged. "Logistics has been doing that with medical orders for the past month or so. Don't know why. Kane says it's efficiency, something about consolidated supply runs." Olivia had filed it away. 2 days later, she was crossing the base toward the commissary when she saw a convoy of 3 trucks being loaded near the secondary storage depot, a facility she'd understood to be used for equipment maintenance, not active supply movement. It was 05:30 in the morning, early enough that the base felt half asleep, which was probably the point. She stopped walking and watched for a moment. The men doing the loading were in unmarked coveralls, not standard base uniforms. The trucks didn't have base ID numbers on the doors. She kept walking. Back in the medical bay, she submitted a secondary requisition for the IV fluids, this time routing it through the base medical officer's channel rather than logistics, and noted the supply discrepancy in the bay's maintenance log. She wasn't making accusations. She was documenting what she saw. That was what you did when something looked off and you weren't sure yet what it was. She didn't know Kane read the medical bay's maintenance log. She found out on Monday morning when he appeared in the bay at 7:30 with Colonel Voss. Voss was the base commander, a big man, 52, who carried his rank the way some people carry weight they've stopped noticing. He was not a cruel man, but he was a decisive one, and he'd been at Fort Calloway for 3 years running a base that ran well and gave him few surprises. He did not like surprises. "Ms. Marsh," he said, using the civilian title deliberately, "I understand you've been documenting supply observations in the medical log." "I noted a supply discrepancy in a convoy movement I couldn't identify," she said. "Standard documentation." "That kind of documentation," Kane said, stepping forward, "creates confusion. It implies irregularities where none exist." "I didn't imply anything. I documented what I observed." "You documented," Kane said, "things that are outside your scope as a coverage nurse. Supply operations on this base are not your concern." "Patient supply levels are my concern," she said. "If IV fluids are being rerouted through a system that delays their delivery to the medical bay, that's a clinical concern." Voss held up a hand, stopping Kane before he could respond. He looked at Olivia for a moment with the measured expression of a man making a decision he'd already half made. Your temporary duty order expires at the end of this week, he said. We'll be processing the conclusion of your assignment effective Friday. Olivia looked at him steadily. My order was extended. Dr. Anselm's return has been delayed. We've made alternate arrangements, Voss said. There was a pause in which nothing moved. I see, Olivia said. Major Kane, Voss said, and that was the end of the conversation. They left. The door swung shut behind them and the bay went quiet. Herrera appeared in the doorway of the exam room. He'd heard it. He looked at her with something between concern and apology. Olivia, we've got a full schedule today, she said, and she picked up the first chart from the tray. The rest of the week moved the way endings move, a little faster than usual, with an undertow you can feel but not see. Word moved around the base the way it does on small installations, through the unofficial channels that run faster than anything official. The coverage nurse was being removed. She'd gotten sideways with Kane. She'd put something in a log she shouldn't have. The versions varied, but the conclusion was the same. Ewan found Olivia at the commissary on Wednesday night and sat across from her without asking. You need to push back, Ewan said. On what grounds? Olivia said. On the grounds that you didn't do anything wrong. I know I didn't, Olivia said. That's different from having grounds. Ewan stared at her. You're not even angry. Olivia considered that. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. I'm angry, she said. It just doesn't look like much on the outside. Ewan wanted to say more. Olivia's expression stopped her. Not cold exactly, but settled in a way that suggested the conversation was over on her terms, not Ewan's. Ewan left after a few minutes. Olivia finished her coffee. The formal removal order landed on Thursday evening, routed through the base administrative office. It said her temporary duty period was concluded effective 0600 Friday. Transportation had been arranged. She was to have her quarters cleared by 0500. Herrera saw the order and came to find her in the medical bay, where she was doing a final inventory of the trauma supplies. This isn't right, he said. No, she agreed. So what are you doing? Finishing the inventory, she said. Whoever comes in after me should know what's here. He watched her for a moment, trying to find something in her face that matched how he felt. He couldn't find it. You could file a complaint, he said. You could go to the IG office. What they're doing to you is... Herrera, she said, not unkindly, I've been removed from positions before. It happens. What matters is that you document your supply levels accurately and you push back on any rerouting that delays critical medical materials. He blinked. That's what you're worried about? The supply chain? I'm worried about a lot of things, she said. But the supplies are the thing you can actually do something about. She handed him the completed inventory sheet. He took it without knowing what else to do. She was packed and ready at 0445. Her duffel sat by the door of the quarters she'd occupied for 6 weeks. The room was exactly as she'd found it, clean, ordered, nothing out of place. Outside, the desert was still dark, the air carrying the particular cold that comes before a Nevada dawn, dry and clear and without mercy. She sat on the edge of the bed and drank the last of her coffee from a thermos she'd made in the small kitchen. She was not thinking about Kane or Voss or the removal order. She was thinking about the convoys she'd seen at 0530, the unmarked trucks, the men in the non-standard coveralls, the way the loading had been done quickly and without the usual base documentation procedures she'd seen on every other supply movement she'd observed in 6 weeks. She was thinking about the medical bay's IV fluid stock, which was down to 60% of required inventory levels despite 3 separate requisitions. She was thinking about a manifest number she'd seen printed on one of the packing crates being loaded onto the second truck, a number she'd recognized because she'd seen it before, on a requisition form that had come through the medical bay 2 weeks earlier and been listed as delivered. A crate listed as delivered to the medical bay was on a truck heading off base in the dark. She'd written the manifest number in the margin of the maintenance log. She doubted anyone would look at it. She hoped someone would. At 5:20, the explosion hit. It wasn't one sound, it was a sequence, a deep concussive thud that you felt in your sternum before you heard it with your ears, then a second blast that was louder and closer, then the sustained roar of something burning very large and very fast. The windows of the quarters shook, the overhead light flickered. Olivia was at the door in 3 seconds, duffel left behind. She moved by instinct more than thought, her feet already finding the path toward the sound before her conscious mind had fully mapped the situation. The fire was visible from the eastern road, a column of orange-black smoke rising against the pre-dawn sky from somewhere beyond the perimeter fence, in the direction of the secondary access road that ran past the equipment maintenance depot. There were secondary flashes, smaller, irregular, the kind produced by pressurized material caught in heat, not a single fuel source. Something compound, multiple materials. She heard the alarm start. She heard people running. She heard a voice on the base PA system, cut through with static and beginning to fracture. All personnel. Hazmat protocol. Sector 3. All personnel. And then the PA went down. She ran toward the medical bay. She ran at the pace she'd shown Ewan on the perimeter road. Not sprinting, but a hard, sustained movement that covered ground without consuming itself. The base was waking up violently around her. Soldiers in various stages of readiness were emerging from buildings, some organized, most not. She saw a sergeant trying to establish a perimeter near the administrative building. 3 soldiers behind him who were listening, 4 who weren't. She saw a vehicle, a light transport, pull out of its bay and immediately stop because there was no clear direction to go. She saw a young airman standing in the middle of the eastern road, looking at the fire column with the open-mouthed paralysis that hits people when the size of a thing doesn't match anything they've been prepared for. Herrera was already at the medical bay when she got there, along with 2 of the junior medics, Callies and Brand. They were pulling equipment, but they were pulling it without a plan, grabbing things, setting them down, grabbing different things. The kind of motion that looks like action, but isn't. "Stop," Olivia said. They stopped. She walked to the wall cabinet, pulled it open, and began pulling specific items in a specific order. 2 full trauma bags, the portable defibrillator, burn kit, airway kit, the folded litter stored behind the cabinet. "Callies, take the burn kit and the second trauma bag. Your secondary triage, you'll work anyone who's stable enough to wait. Brand, defibrillator, and airway kit, you stay with the most critical. Herrera, you're with me." "Where are we going?" Herrera asked. "To where they are," she said. "Olivia, we don't have authorization to leave the PA is down, Sector 3 is burning, and there are people out there," she said, shouldering the first trauma bag. "Authorization can sort itself out after." She was already out the door. The fire was coming from the secondary depot, and it was worse than it looked from the road. The first convoy truck, the lead vehicle she'd seen in the pre-dawn loading, had been carrying pressurized containers, and when the cab caught fire, the containers had failed catastrophically and sequentially. 2 of the 3 trucks were fully involved. The third had been partially shielded by the depot building and was burning from the rear only, but the structure itself was fully ablaze now, and the roofline had already partially collapsed. There were 6 people down that she could see when she arrived, possibly more inside the depot. She moved to the nearest casualty, a soldier in his 20s, unconscious, burns on his arms and right side of his face, pulse irregular but present, airway partially compromised. She opened the airway, positioned him, flagged his status with a piece of tape from her kit marked in black Sharpie. Delayed. Airway managed, burns, monitor pulse, and moved to the next. The second was on his feet but shouldn't have been. Shrapnel in his left thigh, walking on adrenaline, white around the mouth. She got him down, applied a tourniquet, told him to stay flat and yell if he felt faint. "I'm fine, he said. "You're not," she said, and moved on. She worked her way through them methodically, not fast in a panicked way, fast in a trained way, with the particular economy of someone who has done this before in conditions significantly worse than these, who has learned that haste and speed are different things, and that the first one kills people while the second one saves them. Herrera was behind her, executing. He was scared, she could see it, but he was working, which mattered more than whether he was scared. A staff sergeant named Okafor had organized a bucket line that wasn't doing much against the fire, but was keeping it from spreading left, toward the fuel storage. He was doing it without being asked and without authorization from anyone Olivia could see, which made her immediately trust him. She caught his attention. "Anyone inside?" she asked. 2, maybe 3. Maintenance crew, they were doing early work. Structural status? Front half of the building came down. Back half is still standing. For now. Olivia looked at the burning structure. Herrera appeared at her shoulder. Don't, he said. She was already moving. The front entrance was blocked. Collapsed beam, debris field, active fire on the left wall. She moved to the side access door, the one she'd seen on the base diagram in the medical bay orientation package they'd given her in week 1. It opened when she pushed it. The interior was filled with smoke, but the fire hadn't fully reached this section yet. She went in low, standard practice, not instinct. Instinct in a burning building is usually wrong. Training overrides it. She found the first maintenance worker 8 feet in, on the floor, unconscious from smoke inhalation. He was 60 pounds heavier than her, and she dragged him anyway, 10 feet, 15 feet, through the side door and out into the air where Herrera caught him. She went back in for the second one. The second one was awake and terrified and couldn't move. There was a metal shelving unit across his legs that had fallen when the roof section came down. She got her hands under the unit, positioned her feet, and lifted with the muscle memory of someone who had learned to lift heavy things under difficult conditions and had not unlearned it. The unit moved. Not all the way. Enough. She got her hands under the man's arms. Move your legs, she said. I can't. You can, she said. Move them. He moved them. She got him out. Outside, she handed him off to Callie's and turned back toward the burning structure. She counted heads. 2 from inside, 6 from the immediate blast area, 2 more that Callie's had found on the south side of the depot. 10 total. She ran the math against what Okafor had told her. Was there a third person in the maintenance crew? She asked Okafor. He looked at the building. Something crossed his face. Yeah, he said. She looked at the building. The back half was still standing, but it wouldn't be for much longer. The fire was moving in that direction, and the smoke column had changed color, which meant the materials inside were changing. She was calculating time against structural probability when she heard the sound, coughing, coming from behind the building. She ran the perimeter. Behind the back wall, wedged in the narrow gap between the depot and the security fence, was a young private, 19, maybe 20, who had apparently been thrown there by the initial blast. He was conscious, barely, with a probable concussion and a right arm that was at the wrong angle. She got to him. She checked his airway, checked his neck and spine, decided he could be moved, and moved him. Carefully, with Okafor's help, who'd followed her around the building without being asked. How did you know? Okafor asked, as they got the private clear of the wall. The smoke, she said, and someone always ends up behind the building. Okafor looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized. The look of someone recalibrating. She didn't have time for it right now. She went back to her patients. The base had found its footing by 0630. Communication had been partially restored through the backup radio system, and Captain Elise Doran had taken command of the scene and was doing it well, pushing people where they needed to be, establishing clear perimeters, getting the fuel storage flanked on both sides with suppression equipment. Olivia watched her work for a moment and thought, she's good. She's genuinely good at this. Doran found Olivia at the makeshift triage area they'd established on the east side of the depot, using vehicle hoods as litter supports. How many? Doran asked. 11 casualties, Olivia said. 3 critical, 4 serious, 4 walking wounded. 3 are going to need surgical support. The facility on base can handle 1 of them. The other 2 need evac. Doran took the report without blinking. You're the coverage nurse. Yes. Who told you to establish a triage here? Nobody, Olivia said. Doran looked at the triage area, the flagged casualties, the organized equipment, the medics moving in a pattern that made sense. Okay, she said. She turned away and got back to the problem. Olivia was rechecking the airway on her first critical patient when she registered a sound she hadn't heard in a long time. The specific acoustic signature of special operations helicopters on approach. Not the standard military transport rhythm, something heavier, faster, less polite. She looked up. 3 helicopters were dropping fast out of the western sky, moving with the kind of intent that meant they weren't coming to help with a fire. She looked back at her patient. She adjusted the airway. She documented his pulse rate in the margin of the triage form she'd been using, because the form was what they had. Around her, soldiers were turning to look at the approaching aircraft. Some of them were reaching for radios. Some of them were standing very still. Herrera came to stand next to her. "Who are they?" he asked. She watched the helicopters level out on approach. "I'm not sure yet," she said. That was true. What was also true, and what she did not say, was that she recognized the approach pattern, the vector and the speed and the particular way the lead aircraft had cut its altitude. She'd seen it before. A long time ago, from a different side of the landing zone. Her hand stayed steady on her patient. Her face did not change. The first helicopter touched down at the edge of the depot perimeter, and the door came open before the skids were fully on the ground. The world was about to get considerably more complicated. The man who stepped off the first helicopter was not what she expected, which was the first thing she noticed. Not tall, not built like a recruitment poster. Medium height, lean in the way that comes from sustained field work rather than deliberate conditioning, with a face that had been weathered into something permanent by years of outdoor exposure. He wore no insignia she could read from here, but the way he moved across the tarmac, the particular economy of it, the way his eyes swept the scene in a single sustained pass rather than jumping from point to point, told her more than insignia would have. He was followed by 7 others moving in loose formation, none of them looking at anything long enough to suggest uncertainty about where they were going or what they were doing there. Olivia turned back to her patient. Pulse was stabilizing. She adjusted the positioning of his arm, noted the time in the margin of her triage form, and glanced across at Callie's, who was managing the 4 walking wounded with the focused attention of someone who'd been doing this longer than 8 months. He was growing. She could see it happening in real time. Captain Doran intercepted the group before they reached the triage area. Olivia could see the conversation without hearing it. Doran's posture was open but measured. The lead man's was relaxed in the specific way that people are relaxed when they don't need permission for anything. He showed her something. A credential, a document, something on a tablet. She couldn't tell. Doran looked at it, looked at him, and then stepped back and pointed toward the depot building. Then she pointed toward Olivia. The lead man looked in that direction, and for a moment his expression changed in a way so small it almost wasn't there. He changed course. Olivia was rechecking the tourniquet on the soldier with the shrapnel wound when he stopped 3 feet from her. She did not look up immediately. She finished what she was doing, made a note, and then looked up. Up close, she could read the name on his jacket. Calloway was the base. This was not a base soldier. The name on his jacket was Reyes, and below it, smaller, a unit designation she'd seen on paperwork before, in a different context, in a different life. She kept her expression neutral. "Miss Marsh," he said, "Major Reyes." A pause. Behind him, one of his team, a woman, close-cropped hair, carrying a medical bag that was significantly better equipped than Olivia's, was looking at the triage setup with the alert attention of someone assessing work that has been done. "You established this?" Reyes asked, gesturing at the triage area. "Yes." "How many did you pull from inside the building?" "2," she said. "Third was behind the structure. Someone else found the remaining 8. He looked at her for another moment. The look had something in it she couldn't quite name. Not recognition, exactly. Something adjacent to it. "I need to talk to you," he said, "when you have a moment." "I'll let you know when I have a moment," she said, and went back to her patient. He stepped back without argument. Behind him, 3 of his team had fanned out and were already working. The medical specialist had gone directly to the most critical casualty and was running an assessment with the quick precision of someone whose training exceeded what was available at Fort Calloway's standard medical facility. The others had positioned themselves at various points around the perimeter and were talking into radios in the low, efficient registers of people transmitting information rather than requesting it. Herrera appeared at Olivia's side, watching. "Who are they?" he asked quietly. "Get me an update on the 3rd critical," she said. He went. She tracked Reyes in her peripheral vision without appearing to. Colonel Voss arrived at the triage site at 06:45, and he arrived with Kane. That told her something. Voss took in the scene with the practiced eye of a commander looking for the shape of a crisis he didn't cause but now owned. He saw the organized triage, the working medics, the casualty count being managed on the east side of the burning depot. His expression moved through several things. Relief, assessment, a brief private recalibration, before settling into something that looked like command authority, which was, she suspected, mostly a habit of face. Kane stayed a step behind him. He saw Olivia and something in him went sharp and still. "Who authorized this triage location?" Voss asked, addressing Doran. "It was established before I had full situational awareness, sir," Doran said. "It's the correct location." Voss looked at the triage. He looked at Olivia. "Miss Marsh," he said. "Colonel," she said. There was a fractional pause in which both of them acknowledged without words that this was a complicated moment. She had a removal order with her name on it. She was currently keeping 3 of his soldiers alive. "You were supposed to be gone by now," he said. Not accusatory, almost puzzled. "The situation changed," she said. He nodded, slowly, like a man absorbing something he hadn't planned for. "What do you need?" "Surgical evac for 2 as soon as possible. The 3rd I can stabilize here if we have another 2 hours. I need someone to confirm the fuel storage is fully secured because, if it's not, the eastern casualties need to be moved again. And I need Major Reyes's medical specialist to stay where she is, because she's better equipped for the penetrating trauma on Casualty 4 than anything I have in these bags." Voss blinked. "You know who they are." "I know what they brought," she said. "That's enough." He looked at her for another long moment, then turned to Doran. "Get me the evac timeline." Kane had not spoken. He was watching Olivia with an expression she could only describe as calculating, the look of someone running numbers in their head, trying to work out how a situation that had been solved had become unsolved. She turned her back on him and went back to work. The next 90 minutes were the kind that compress in memory afterward. Not because nothing happened, but because everything happened in the specific rhythm that emergencies create, where time becomes purely functional. A thing takes as long as it takes. You don't notice duration. The 2 critical casualties went out on the first evac helicopter at 07:23. The medical specialist, Olivia learned her name was Sergeant Priya Balan, stayed with the 3rd critical, and they worked in the companionable near silence of 2 people who know what they're doing in proximity to each other. Balan was fast. She was also careful in the way that matters. She double-checked before she moved on. She communicated her findings aloud without being asked. She didn't assume. "How long have you been doing trauma work?" Balan asked, during a brief stretch where both their patients were stable enough to allow 3 seconds of actual conversation. "Long time," Olivia said. Balan looked at her with an expression that suggested she understood the answer wasn't evasion, but compression. Too much to explain in 3 seconds, so reduce it to something true. "You've done austere environment work," Balan said. It wasn't a question. "Some," Olivia said. "I can tell. You wasted nothing." Olivia glanced at her. "Neither did you." They went back to work. It was Herrera who noticed Kane moving toward the secondary access road, the road that led to the back of the depot, where the 3rd truck in the convoy had been partially shielded from the worst of the blast. Herrera noticed it because he was walking a supply route between the triage area and the medical bay, and Kane's trajectory was odd. Not toward the command post, not toward Voss, not toward any of the obvious locations where a man in his position should be during a base emergency. He almost didn't say anything. Then he thought about the IV fluids and the maintenance log, and Olivia's face when she'd handed him the inventory sheet at 04:45 that morning, which felt like a week ago. He found Olivia between patients. "Kane's heading toward the 3rd truck," he said quietly. She didn't react visibly. She looked in that direction, registered the moving figure, looked back at Herrera. "Tell Doran," she said. "Tell Doran what?" "Tell her Kane's moving toward the convoy vehicle, and that she might want to know why." Herrera went. Olivia did not go after Kane herself. She went back to her patients. She had 3 people in front of her who were alive and intended to stay that way, and that was the work. The rest was not her job. She believed that. Mostly. Tit. Reyes came to her again at 07:40, when the triage had stabilized enough that Brand could manage the remaining casualties without her direct oversight. "Now," he said. "Now," she agreed. They moved to the edge of the perimeter, outside the noise of the scene. He stood with his back to the depot, which put him facing away from his own team. Deliberate, she noted. Your name was flagged 3 hours ago, he said, before we launched. She looked at him. Flagged by what? A system alert. The manifest number you logged in the medical bay maintenance record. It matched an open federal investigation. He paused. You logged it yesterday. I logged it Tuesday, she said. Yesterday I was in the process of being removed from this base. Something in his jaw tightened. The removal order came from Kane. It was signed by Colonel Voss. Because Kane told him you were creating operational disruption. He said it flatly, without editorializing. The investigation is 3 months old. Kane's been moving materials off this installation through the maintenance depot. Medical supplies, equipment, some things that fall into a category I can't detail to you out here, using falsified manifests, routing them through a shell contractor, selling them, replacing them in the inventory with compromised or expired product. The IV fluids, she thought, running low, the requisitions bouncing back. He was selling our supplies, she said. Among other things, the investigation had a geographic focus. We knew it was happening somewhere in this logistics network. We didn't have a specific installation confirmed until your flag. She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the controlled chaos of the aftermath continued. Vehicles moving, people moving, the fire still burning down to something manageable on the western side of the depot. The convoy, she said, this morning. We believe the explosion was an accident, pressurized containers being moved at speed in the dark by people who weren't following handling protocols. He paused. He was trying to move the remaining evidence before your documentation triggered a formal review. She absorbed that. She had flagged a manifest number in a maintenance log as a supply discrepancy. She had not known it would trigger anything. She had not known about an investigation. She had simply written down what she saw, because that was what you did. 11 people got hurt, she said. Yes. Because he was covering himself. Yes. She looked out at the triage area, at Herrera and Brand and Callie still moving through their work, at Ballon stabilizing the final critical, at the young private with the dislocated shoulder sitting against a vehicle wheel with his arm in the improvised sling she'd put together from trauma bag materials. What do you need from me? She said. Your documentation, your testimony when it comes to that. And he stopped. And? She said. He looked at her directly. There are people in this investigation who know your name, from before, who flagged it immediately when it came up. She did not move. She kept her face exactly where it was. That's not relevant to the current situation, she said. No, he said. It's not. But it will be. She held his gaze for a moment, then turned and walked back toward her patients. At 08:12, Doran appeared at the edge of the triage area with 2 of Reyes's team and a look on her face that meant something had shifted. Kane's at the vehicle, she said to Olivia. Low, direct, no preamble. I know, Olivia said. He opened the back of the truck. He was pulling materials, packages, didn't look like standard equipment. Did you stop him? Reyes's team did. Kane invoked his logistics authority. Doran's expression was controlled but barely. He's calling it an authorized material review. He's calling Reyes's involvement an unauthorized incursion on base operations. Olivia looked at her. Where is he now? Heading to the command building. He's going to Voss. In the 14 months that Major Victor Kane had run logistics at Fort Calloway, he had learned one thing about commanding officers. When cornered, go to the top immediately, loudly, and with a version of events that leaves no room for a competing narrative. You don't wait for the other side to speak first. You establish the frame. He knew Voss. He'd worked with Voss for 3 years. He knew that Voss trusted continuity, trusted the officers who had kept this base running without surprises, and did not like having outsiders arrive without notice and start moving through his installation like they owned it. He could work with that. What he had not factored into his calculation was Reyes. Not the rank, not the unit, not the federal authority. Something else. The way Reyes had looked at Kane when his team had intercepted him at the truck, before Kane had invoked anything. That look. Kane had been invoking authority for a long time. He knew what people looked like when they were uncertain about whether to accept it. Reyes had not looked uncertain. Olivia was redressing a wound on Okafor. The staff sergeant had a deep laceration on his left forearm he'd received during the bucket line action and hadn't mentioned until the crisis had settled enough for him to notice it, when Balin came to her. "Your colonel's coming," Balin said. Olivia looked up. Voss was crossing the triage area with the stride of a man who had just had an unpleasant conversation and was working out what to do about it. Behind him was Kane, and the expression Kane was wearing was the one she'd seen on his face the day he'd come into the medical bay with Voss to tell her she was being removed, that particular compound of certainty and calculation. She tied off the dressing on Okafor's arm, told him to keep it elevated, and stood up. Voss stopped 5 feet from her. He looked at the triage setup, at the remaining casualties, at the established routes his medics were still working. He was running numbers of his own. She could see it. "Ms. Marsh," he said, "Major Kane has raised concerns about the federal team's presence on this base." "That's between Major Kane and the federal team," she said. "He's indicated that you may have misrepresented supply information in the medical bay's documentation in a way that—" "The maintenance log is still in the medical bay," she said. "The entries are dated and timed. I didn't misrepresent anything." "She didn't," Herrera said. Both Voss and Olivia looked at him. He'd appeared from the direction of the medical supply route, and he was holding a folder, the printed copy of the maintenance log she'd been running since week 2, which he had apparently gone to retrieve from the medical bay. He held it out. Not to Voss. To the space between them. "I can read you the relevant entry," he said, "or you can read it yourself. Either way." Kane's expression shifted. Voss took the folder. He read it again, the date, the manifest number. The precise, factual, unembellished language that Olivia wrote in documentation because she'd learned early that documentation that told a story was documentation that could be contested, but documentation that stated facts was harder to argue with. Something crossed Voss's face that might have been discomfort, or might have been the beginning of understanding, or might have been both at once. "Victor," he said, using Kane's first name, not his rank, in a way that seemed to catch Kane off guard. "What's on that truck?" "Standard logistics materials being reviewed for—" "What's on the truck, Victor?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing on that base since the explosion. Kane did not answer. He had a dozen answers available. She could see him sorting through them. He had used his answers before, in smaller rooms with less at stake, and they had worked. The difference now was that Reyes's team was behind him. The difference now was that there was a federal investigation number tied to a manifest number that was sitting in a dated and timed medical log entry that a corporal had just handed to the base commander. The difference now was that 6 weeks ago, a nurse nobody had looked at twice had written something down. And she was still here. Kane made a decision. She saw it. The moment it happened, the small adjustment in his posture, the way his attention shifted from Voss toward the perimeter, toward the road, toward the calculation of whether there was still a version of this where he walked away. She had seen that calculation before, in better people and in worse. It always looked the same. She took one step back, out of his line, and looked at Reyes. Reyes was already moving. His team had been positioned, she realized now, with that possibility in mind. Not obvious, not aggressive, just present at the right points. The way you position people when you'd been doing this long enough to know where someone was likely to go when they ran out of road. Kane didn't get 3 steps before 2 of them were beside him, and the voice Reyes used, quiet, precise, completely without drama, said something that contained the words, "Federal investigation and material evidence, and you need to come with us." Voss stood very still. Herrera stood very still. Okafor, from his position against the vehicle with his freshly dressed arm elevated, watched it happen with the expression of a man watching something he's going to be thinking about for a long time. Olivia looked at Kane once, as they walked him past. He looked back at her. The calculation was gone. What was left was something rawer and less composed, the face behind the face of a man who had built something carefully for a long time and was watching it disassemble in real time and could not stop it. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She turned back to Okafor. "Keep it elevated," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said very quietly. She checked his dressing one more time, made a note on the triage form, and began organizing the documentation for handoff. The evac had taken the 2 critical casualties. The third would be stable enough for transport within the hour. The walking wounded were walking. The work was close to finished, but something was not finished. She could feel it in the particular weight of the moment, the way Reyes had looked at her when he said people who know your name, the way he'd stopped himself, then continued anyway. She had kept that door closed for a long time. She'd closed it on purpose, not because of weakness, but because of the particular kind of strength that knows what it can carry and what it can't. She had walked away from one life and built another one, and the new one was quieter and smaller, and she had not entirely decided how she felt about that. She filed the last triage form. She capped her Sharpie. She looked out across what remained of the depot. The smoke, the organized aftermath, the soldiers doing the slow, necessary work of accounting for what had been lost and what had held. Somewhere behind the command building, Major Victor Kane was being formally detained by a federal team, and the base that had handed her a removal order 12 hours ago was beginning to understand that something had happened here that nobody in the chain of command had seen coming. Except her. And even she hadn't seen all of it. Her radio crackled. Ballin's voice. "Marsh, I need you to come look at something." The tone was controlled, which with Ballin, she was learning, meant the opposite of calm. She picked up her trauma bag and moved. Ballin was crouched over the casualty Olivia had mentally designated as stable for. The private with the concussion she'd pulled from behind the depot wall. He was 19 years old, his name was Feist, and he had been coherent 40 minutes ago when she'd last checked him. He was not coherent now. Ballin looked up when Olivia arrived. GCS dropped 6 points in the last 12 minutes. He's posturing. Olivia was down beside him before Ballin finished the sentence. Feist's eyes were half open, the left pupil noticeably larger than the right. His breathing had taken on the irregular cadence that meant his brain was doing something it wasn't supposed to be doing, and his right arm was drawing in against his body in the rigid flex that nobody who knew what it meant wanted to see. "Epidural bleed," Olivia said. "That's my read," Ballin said. "How long do we have?" "At this rate? 40 minutes before he herniates? Maybe less." Olivia stood up and looked around the scene. The nearest surgical capability was the base medical facility, which had a minor surgery suite that was not designed for a cranial emergency, and the trauma center at Delman Regional was 53 minutes by ground. She knew the ground time because she'd memorized the base's emergency transport matrix in week 1, the same way she'd memorized the depot diagram and the supply protocols and every other piece of procedural information that most people assigned to a 4-week temporary posting wouldn't have bothered with. "Evac helicopter," she said. "Both are out. First one hasn't reached Delman yet, second just launched with Casualty 3. Radio them back?" "Already checked. Fuel state on both is committed. Pulling either back extends the timeline for the critical casualties already on board." Ballin's voice was level and precise. She was giving Olivia information, not opinion. The decision was not hers to make. Olivia did the arithmetic. None of the outcomes it produced were good. She ran it again. "What's on base?" she said. "The surgery suite. Herrera's there now. I already asked him what they have. He said the suite has a basic cranial tray. It hasn't been opened since the previous surgeon rotation." "Who certified it last?" "He's checking." Olivia looked at Feist. The posturing was worsening. Subtle, but she was watching for it. The window was closing in real time. "Get me Voss," she said. Voss came. He looked at Feist, looked at Olivia, and to his credit, he did not ask questions that wasted time. "You want to use the surgery suite," he said. "I need to use it. There's no other option within the timeline." "You're not a surgeon." "No," she said, "but I've done this procedure under worse conditions than a base medical facility." She held his gaze. "I need you to make a decision, Colonel. Right now, not in 5 minutes." Something crossed his face. Not doubt exactly. The specific weight of responsibility making contact with reality. He was the base commander. If she opened that suite and something went wrong, it was on him. If she didn't open it and Feist died from a bleed they'd had 40 minutes to address, that was also on him. "Do it," he said. She was already moving. The surgery suite smelled like a room that hadn't been used in 8 months, which is to say it smelled faintly of chemical preservatives and the particular staleness of sealed medical equipment. Herrera had the lights on and the tray out by the time she arrived. He'd also pulled the certification log, which showed the cranial instruments had been last verified 11 months ago by the base's previous surgical officer. 11 months was not ideal. It was workable. Balin came in behind her, already gowned. She'd read Olivia's intention without being asked and had prepared accordingly, which meant Olivia didn't have to spend 30 seconds explaining what she needed from her. "Have you done a burr hole before?" Olivia asked her. "Twice. Both in the field." Balin's jaw was set. "Both patients survived." "Good. Then you know it's not clean." "I know," Balin said. Herrera looked between them. "What do you need from me?" "Keep his airway managed, monitor his pressure every 2 minutes, and tell me the second anything changes that I need to know about. If you're not sure whether I need to know, tell me anyway." "Okay," he said. He swallowed once. Then he moved to his position. They brought Feist in on the litter, and Olivia had her first real look at him under surgical light. 19 years old, a scratch on his chin that was older than today's injuries, a military haircut that had grown out unevenly, the particular look of someone who had barely finished becoming a person before the world started putting demands on him. She noticed these things, and then she set them aside, because noticing them was human and setting them aside was necessary, and the ability to do both in quick succession was something she had learned the hard way. She took a breath. She found the instrument. She began. Chad. The procedure took 31 minutes. It was not clean, as she'd told Balin it wouldn't be. There were 2 moments of significant complication. One when Feist's pressure spiked in a way that required immediate adjustment, and Herrera called it before she had to ask. And one when the initial positioning of the burr proved insufficient, and she had to correct her approach, which cost her 4 minutes she didn't have to spare. Balin managed both complications without excess movement or noise, which was the specific kind of competence Olivia respected most. Not the absence of difficulty, but the refusal to amplify it. When it was done, and the bleed was addressed and Feist's pupils were returning toward symmetry, Herrera made a sound that was not quite a word. "Say it," Olivia said, pulling off her gloves. "I didn't know you could do that," he said. "I know," she said. She stripped the gown. She was aware of her hands. She looked at them briefly, the way she always did after, checking for tremor. There was a slight shake in her left hand. There always was afterward now. It had started 3 years ago and hadn't stopped. It went away after 20 minutes. She put her hands in her pockets and walked out to the hallway. "What?" Reyes was waiting outside the surgery suite. He was leaning against the opposite wall with his arms crossed, and his expression in that particular neutral state that was not blankness but something more deliberate, the face of someone who has learned to hold information quietly until the right moment. "He's going to be okay," she said, before he could ask. "I know, Balin texted me." A pause. "I've been making some calls." "About?" "About you." He said it without apology. "I told you there were people in this investigation who know your name." "I wasn't being general." She leaned against the wall beside him, not looking at him, looking at the corridor, at the functional ugliness of a military hallway, the institutional paint, the mounted emergency procedures posters, the overhead fluorescent that had a flicker in it that nobody had fixed. "Operation Black Ridge," she said. "Yes." She hadn't said those words out loud in a long time. They sat differently in the air of a Nevada-based medical hallway than they had sat in other places. "That's classified," she said. "The existence of it is classified," Reyes said. "What you did during it has been classified above your access level for 6 years. The people whose names are attached to that record know what happened. They've known the whole time." She turned her head and looked at him. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because one of those names," he said, "is the person who sent us here." The fluorescent light flickered. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. She looked back at the wall. She thought about 6 years of a life she had built deliberately quiet. She thought about a duffel bag by a door at 04:45 that morning, in a room that looked exactly as she'd found it. "Who?" she said. He told her. She was still for a moment. Then she pushed off the wall and walked toward the exit without another word. He let her go. He'd expected that. Outside, the base had settled into the specific exhaustion of a crisis that has passed its acute phase. The fire at the depot was out. A blackened skeleton of the structure remained, still smoking at the joints, but the active burn was done. Voss had established a command post near the vehicle bay, and there was the organized movement of people doing the necessary unglamorous work of aftermath: accounting, reporting, clearing debris, documenting. The sun had fully risen, and it was hot now, the desert heat landing without transition, as it does, turning the morning air from cold to bright without anything in between. Herrera found her at the edge of the tarmac, where she'd sat down on a concrete barrier and was drinking water from a bottle she'd taken from the medical supply run, without thinking about it. He sat down next to her without asking. She moved over slightly to give him room. They sat in silence for a moment. "Feist is stable," he said. "I know. Balin says he has a good prognosis." "Good." Another silence. A vehicle moved across the tarmac 30 feet away. Someone was running a generator somewhere. "Olivia," Herrera said. "Yeah." "Who are you?" She looked at him. He was not asking it dramatically. He was asking it the way you ask someone a genuine question when the answer you thought you had has turned out to be significantly incomplete. She looked back at the tarmac. "I was a combat medic," she said. "Before I was a nurse. I spent 7 years in field assignments, 3 in conventional units, 4 in specialized operations." She paused. "I left. I did my transition training, got my RN certification, took hospital positions, and then coverage positions." "Why coverage?" She considered the question. It deserved a real answer. "Because I could leave," she said. "When a place went wrong, I could leave." He was quiet for a moment. "Like this place." "I had a removal order," she said. "That was leaving technically." "Technically," he said, and something in his voice was somewhere between tired and fond in a way she hadn't heard from him before. She almost smiled. She didn't, quite. "You're going to be fine," she told him. "You're better than you think you are. The work you did today, you made good decisions, fast decisions, under pressure." He looked at her. "I followed you." "You followed until you didn't need to," she said. "That's different from just following." He didn't answer that. He looked at the burned depot. "What happens now?" he said. She didn't answer because at that moment her radio crackled with Reyes's voice. "Marsh, command building, now." His tone had changed, not alarmed, controlled, but with something behind the control that hadn't been there before. She stood. She set down the water bottle. She looked at the burned depot for 1 second. Then she went. The command building at Fort Calloway was a functional, low-slung structure with the atmosphere of a space that had absorbed many years of difficult conversations and retained none of them. Conference Room B was at the back. She'd been in it once, in her second week, for a base-wide medical briefing that Kane had also attended and that she hadn't thought much about at the time. She thought about it now as she walked down the corridor, because Kane had spent 40 minutes in that meeting explaining the base's new supply consolidation protocol. And she had filed it under logistics, not my concern, and moved on. She filed things differently now. Reyes was in Conference Room B with Doran, 2 members of his team, and a woman Olivia had not seen before. Older, in her mid-50s, with the kind of posture that doesn't come from military training, but from a long time making decisions that other people had to implement. She was in civilian clothes. She had a federal ID on a lanyard and a tablet in front of her, and she was reading something on it when Olivia came in. The woman looked up. Olivia stopped. She knew this face. Not well. She had seen it twice, both times in conditions that made detailed observation difficult. Once across a landing zone in a country she had signed documents agreeing not to name. Once in a debriefing room 6 years ago, the last time anyone had formally spoken to her about what she'd done and what it had cost. The woman looked at her for a moment. "Sit down, Olivia," she said. Her name was Carver. That was the only name Olivia had ever had for her. She sat. The investigation into Kane's supply network has been running for 93 days, Carver said, without preliminary. We've identified shell contractors in 4 states, falsified manifests across 11 installations, and diverted materials including medical supplies, communications equipment, and classified hardware that I'm not going to detail in this room. She set down the tablet. The Fort Callaway connection was the last piece we needed. Your documentation gave us the physical evidence to tie this installation to the network. Olivia looked at her. You could have gotten that evidence without 11 casualties. Yes, Carver said. Not defensive, just yes. The timeline, Olivia said. You were building the federal case. You needed more time. We needed 1 more week, Carver said. Kane moved faster than our model predicted. The convoy at 0530 was not in our operational picture. Because you didn't have someone watching the 0530 loading. Correct. But I was there, Olivia said, by accident, because I run in the mornings. Carver's expression did not change, but something in it shifted very slightly. Yes. Olivia looked at the table. She looked at her hands. The tremor was gone. It had been gone for 20 minutes, as it always was. What do you need from me? She said. Again. The same question she'd asked Reyes on the perimeter 4 hours ago. Carver leaned forward. Your testimony is straightforward. We'll handle the documentation chain. She paused. But that's not why I'm here. Then why are you here? Because the network Kane was part of didn't start with Kane. Carver turned the tablet around. On the screen was a document, redacted in several places, but not entirely. Names, dates, locations, a structure. It goes up, it goes sideways. It touches things that are larger and more serious than one logistics major at a desert installation. Olivia looked at the document. She read the parts she could read. She looked up. You want me to do something, she said. I want you to consider something, Carver said carefully. There's a difference? For the first time, something crossed Carver's face that might, in different lighting, have been the beginning of a smile. In this office, she said, there's always a difference. Olivia looked at Reyes. He was watching her with the steady attention of someone who already knew what the question was going to be and was waiting to see what she did with it. Doran was looking at the table. The 2 team members were looking at the door, which meant they were here for the room and not the conversation. She looked back at Carver. Show me the rest, she said. Carver turned the tablet back toward herself. She pressed something. She turned it around again. The document was no longer redacted. Olivia read it. She read all of it. It took 4 minutes, and she did not look up once during those 4 minutes. And when she finished, she sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, at the fluorescent light that, in this room, did not flicker. She thought about a duffel bag. She thought about coverage positions you could leave. She thought about a perimeter road at dawn. She thought about Feist, 19 years old, who was alive because she had been in this building and had known what to look for and had chosen to write it down. She looked at Carver. When? She said. Carver opened her mouth to answer. The door opened. Reyes's team member, the one who had been watching the door, turned and received something. A tablet. She looked at it, and then she looked at Reyes, and the expression on her face changed everything in the room. Sir, she said, Kane's attorney just filed a federal motion. 30 minutes ago, before we had him formally processed. She turned the tablet toward Reyes. He's claiming the investigation was contaminated by unauthorized documentation, specifically the medical bay log. She paused. His attorney is arguing that the log was created by a civilian contractor operating outside her authorized scope, and that any evidence chain originating from it is legally compromised. The room went very quiet. Olivia stared at the table. He was going to try to use her removal order against the investigation. He was going to argue that because Voss had signed an order removing her from the base, she had no legitimate standing to be documenting anything in the medical bay after a certain point. He was going to try to collapse the evidence chain at its origin, at her. She looked at Carver. Carver was already on her phone. Reyes was looking at Olivia with an expression that was asking a question he hadn't said out loud yet. She already knew what it was. Because the answer to Kane's motion, the thing that would determine whether 93 days of federal investigation held or collapsed, depended entirely on who Olivia Marsh officially was what her authorized standing had been, and whether the records that answered those questions were still where they were supposed to be. Records that had been classified above her own access level for 6 years. Records that only one person in this room had the authority to release. She looked at Carver. "Tell me you have the clearance to pull my file," she said. Carver lowered her phone. The look on her face was not reassurance. It was something harder than that. "I have the clearance," she said. "What I don't have is confirmation that the file is still intact." "What does that mean?" Reyes asked. Carver set her phone face down on the table. Not a casual gesture, a deliberate one, the kind that meant she was about to say something she didn't want recorded even accidentally. Olivia's service record from the classified period was held in a restricted archive under a compartmentalized access protocol, she said. Standard procedure for personnel involved in operations at that classification level. 6 years ago, when she transitioned out, the record was supposed to be maintained under a dual-key system, my office and the originating unit command. Supposed to be, Olivia said. 14 months ago, the originating unit was restructured. Personnel rotated. The dual-key protocol requires both holders to verify the archive annually. Carver paused. The last verification was 18 months ago. We flagged it as an administrative gap. We expected to resolve it in the next audit cycle. And then Kane's attorney filed 30 minutes ago, Reyes said. Yes. The room processed that. What it meant was precise and ugly. The evidence chain anchoring the federal investigation ran through Olivia's documentation. Olivia's documentation derived its legal legitimacy from her authorized standing on the base, and her authorized standing, the full picture of who she actually was and what she was actually qualified to do, lived in a file that may or may not still exist in retrievable form. Kane's attorney had probably known about the archive gap, or someone above Kane had known, and had filed the motion because they understood exactly where the chain was weakest. Olivia looked at Carver. How long to verify the archive status? My office is working it now. Best case, 4 hours. And if the file isn't intact? Carver held her gaze. Then we rebuild the evidence chain from other sources. It's slower, it's possible, but it gives Kane's legal team a window. A window to do what? Doran asked. She'd been quiet through most of this, absorbing. To negotiate, Reyes said. To turn partial cooperation into reduced exposure. To make the case complicated enough that the people above Kane in the network have time to create distance. He looked at Olivia. The motion is a delay tactic. Every hour Kane's attorney buys is an hour for someone higher up the chain to move. Olivia pushed back her chair and stood up. She walked to the window, a narrow one, looking out over the tarmac toward the blackened skeleton of the depot. The smoke was a thin column now, mostly gray, nearly done. She stood there for a moment. The operation, she said. Black Ridge. What exactly is in that file? Carver answered carefully. Your deployment record, your role classification, the commendations. There were 3, 2 of which were classified at the time of issue, and the after-action report that documents your specific actions during the operation, which establishes your combat medical qualifications significantly above your civilian certification level. Which is why Kane's attorney is targeting it, Olivia said. If I'm just a coverage nurse acting outside her scope, the log is contaminated. If I'm a decorated combat medic with field surgical experience operating in a capacity consistent with her actual qualifications, the log stands. Yes, Carver said. Olivia turned from the window. Then we don't wait for archive verification. Everyone in the room looked at her. There are living witnesses to Black Ridge, she said. People who were there. People whose names are not classified, even if the operation is. She looked at Carver. You're one of them. Carver was very still. A witness declaration doesn't replace the official record, she said. No, Olivia said, but it establishes a factual predicate that makes the archive gap a procedural issue rather than a substantive one. It shifts the burden. She held Carver's gaze. You know I'm right. The silence in the room lasted approximately 5 seconds. It felt longer. I know you're right, Carver said. I also know that my declaration pulls me formally into the evidentiary chain, which creates its own complications for the broader investigation. I'm not asking you to compromise the investigation, Olivia said. I'm asking you to tell the truth about who I am." Another silence. Carver picked up her phone. The next 3 hours at Fort Calloway moved on two separate tracks that had nothing to do with each other in appearance and everything to do with each other in consequence. On the first track, the base conducted its aftermath. Debris teams cleared the depot site. The medical bay processed the final walking wounded casualties and completed their documentation. Herrera wrote up the triage record with the particular care of someone who understands that what gets written becomes permanent, and made sure that every action, every decision, every timeline was noted with the precision Olivia had modeled for him across 6 weeks of watching her work. Feist remained stable in the base medical facility's recovery area, sedated and monitored by Balin, who had not left his side. Okafor's forearm laceration was properly sutured by Brand, who did it without being asked and without making a production of it. On the second track, a legal and administrative action was being fought in real time across secure communications channels that ran between Fort Calloway's command building, a federal office in Washington, a military legal office in Colorado, and a courthouse filing system where Kane's attorney had submitted a motion at 9:47 in the morning with the specific intention of making as much trouble as possible before noon. Olivia was not in either of these rooms. She was in the hallway outside Conference Room B, sitting on a bench that had probably been there since the building was constructed, with a cup of coffee she'd gotten from the machine near the duty desk and hadn't finished. She was not on her phone. She was not reading anything. She was sitting with her arms on her knees and her eyes on the middle distance, doing the particular kind of thinking that doesn't look like thinking from the outside. Doran found her there at 11:30. "Carver's declaration went in 20 minutes ago," Doran said, sitting down beside her without ceremony. "Legal says it's enough to sustain the evidentiary chain pending archive verification." Olivia nodded. "The motion is still active," Doran continued. "Kane's attorney is pushing for a formal hearing." "They'll push for everything they can get," Olivia said. "That's their job." Doran looked at her for a moment. She was in her early 30s, Olivia had decided. The right side of experienced, the kind of officer who had done enough to know that the situations that test you most are rarely the ones you prepare for. "Colonel Voss wants to speak with you," Doran said. "I know." "Are you ready for that?" Olivia picked up her coffee cup, looked at it, set it back down. He signed the removal order because someone gave him bad information and he didn't ask enough questions. That's not a character failure. That's a pressure failure. Most people fail under pressure. They fail toward the path of least resistance. She paused. "I don't particularly need an apology from him, but I think he needs to give one." Doran was quiet for a moment. "That's a strange way to think about it." "It's the honest way," Olivia said. Voss was in his office, not the conference room. He'd chosen the smaller space deliberately, she thought. The office was his, which meant it had the weight of accountability in it rather than the neutral air of a meeting room. He was standing when she came in, which also meant something. He didn't sit until she did. He looked worse than he had this morning. Not in a dramatic way, just the gradual deflation that happens to people when the thing they thought they understood about a situation turns out to have been a version of the situation that someone else constructed for them. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You don't," she said. "Kane gave you a story that fit the frame you had. A temporary coverage nurse causing administrative disruption by documenting things outside her scope. It fit. You acted on it." "I acted on it without asking enough questions," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's true." He looked at her. She hadn't softened it, and he registered that without flinching. "Your file," he said. "Carver briefed me. I had no idea." "You weren't supposed to," she said. "That was the point of classifying it." "Still." He shook his head once, a small movement, not theatrical. 11 soldiers were hurt on my base because I removed the person who was paying attention, because I took the word of a man I trusted over documentation I hadn't read." She looked at him directly. "The soldiers who were hurt, that's on Kane. The choices he made about what to move and when to move it, and how to do it in the dark while rushing, are what caused that explosion. Not your removal order." "The removal order kept you off the base for the 4 hours before the explosion," he said. "If you'd still been—" "I stayed," she said. He blinked. The order went out Thursday evening. The explosion was Friday at 05:20. I was still in my quarters with my bag packed when it happened. She held his gaze. I'm not saying that to make this easier on you. I'm saying it because the timeline is the timeline, and what you do with accurate information matters. He was quiet for a moment. What do I do with it? He said. You fix the supply documentation protocol, she said. You build a system where a requisition discrepancy in the medical bay can't be redirected without triggering an independent review. You make sure Herrera and Callies and Brand get the recognition they've earned because they worked this morning like people significantly more experienced than their rank suggests, and that needs to be on record. She paused. And you stop letting one person control the entire supply chain narrative without a check. He nodded slowly, like someone taking notes in his head. Is there anything you need? He asked. Yes, she said. I need you to give a formal statement to the investigation confirming the timeline of my removal order and the documentation I submitted prior to it. It will help establish that my logging of the manifest number was done during my authorized period of duty. Done, he said, without hesitation. She stood. He stood. Ms. Marsh, he said. She waited. I judged your title, he said. I should have judged your record. She held his gaze for a moment. You didn't have access to my record, she said. That's the system that needs to change. She left. He stood in the middle of his office and looked at the space where she'd been. At 1347, the Federal Archive verification came back. The file was intact. The dual key protocol gap had been administrative. A missed verification cycle, not a deletion or tampering. The file existed, was complete, and was now formally entered into the evidentiary chain supporting the investigation. Kane's attorney received notification at 1351. The motion for evidentiary exclusion was formally denied at 1423. Olivia was in the medical bay when Reyes found her to tell her, sitting on a stool near the supply shelf she'd reorganized in her first week, looking at the inventory Herrera had updated that morning. It held, Reyes said. Good, she said. Kane's attorney is now pivoting to a cooperation argument, trying to negotiate reduced charges in exchange for testimony against people above him in the network. She looked at him. Will it work? Some version of it will, probably. That's how these things go. His jaw was tight. Not satisfaction. The specific dissatisfaction of someone who has done this long enough to know that the justice available in practice rarely matches the justice available in principle. But he goes to prison, she said. Yes, Reyes said. He goes to prison. She nodded and went back to the inventory. He watched her for a moment. Carver wants to see you again. When you're ready. I know what she wants, Olivia said. And? She was quiet for a moment, running her finger down the inventory list, noting the current IV fluid stock, which was still low because the requisitions that had been bouncing for weeks hadn't been resolved yet, and that was a problem that would outlast today's drama. Tell her I'll be there in an hour, she said. I need to finish this first. The formal processing of Kane's detention happened at 1500 in the base security office, and it was not the loud public moment that the morning's chaos had been. It was the quiet administrative version of an ending. Forms, signatures, the physical transfer of a person from one kind of custody to another. Kane was in a chair when they processed him, in the civilian clothes he'd changed into after the fire, no longer in uniform because the uniform implied an authority he no longer had. He looked smaller than he had at 0730 that morning, standing behind Colonel Voss and pointing at a documentation entry in a medical bay log. Not in the way that people shrink when they're humiliated. In the way they shrink when the architecture they've been standing on is removed and they have to stand on actual ground for the first time in a long time. Reyes was present for the processing. So was a federal attorney named Quinlan who had arrived via ground transport from Reno at 1340 and had the efficient, bloodless quality of someone who spends most of their professional life cleaning up after people who thought they were smarter than the system. Doran observed from the doorway. She'd asked Reyes if that was permitted. He'd said yes without asking why. He could probably see that she needed to see it, the completion of something she'd been part of, closed properly, with the right people in the right positions. She watched Kane sign the detention paperwork. His hand was steady. She gave him that. Whatever else he had the composure to keep his hand steady on the paper that formalized his own arrest. He looked up once before they took him out. Not at Doran, not at Reyes. He looked toward the window, which framed a piece of the tarmac and a corner of the sky, and his expression was the kind that has no name in ordinary language. The expression of someone doing a rapid private accounting of all the decisions that led to a specific moment, in the seconds before they have to stop doing that and go. Then they took him out. Doran released a breath she hadn't noticed she was holding. Fact. Okafor found Olivia at 15:30, sitting on the concrete barrier near the tarmac again, in the same spot she'd occupied with Herrera that morning. The sun was far enough west now to put the barrier in partial shade, which was the only comfortable place to be outside at Fort Calloway in the afternoon. He sat beside her. His arm was in a proper sling now. Brand had done a better job than her improvised version from this morning, though she noticed the dressing underneath was secure. They sat without talking for a while. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had been through something physical and disorienting and were letting their nervous systems finish the conversation their minds had already moved past. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Okafor said. "What?" "That bucket line," he said, "at the fire. That was the stupidest thing I've ever done. It wasn't doing anything. It kept the fire from spreading left," she said. "You bought about 40 minutes before the suppression equipment got there." He looked at her. "You calculated that?" "While I was working," she said. "You were doing the right thing. It didn't look heroic, but it was correct." He was quiet for a moment. "The private you pulled from behind the building," he said. "Feist." "He's going to be okay," she said. "Yeah." He looked out at the tarmac. "My first posting, 8 years ago, we had a medic, Sergeant Vance. She was, I don't know, like you, not flashy, just always right. When things went bad, she was right, and afterward you couldn't understand how she'd known." He paused. "She died in a training accident 2 years in, stupid thing, nothing to do with combat. I thought about her today." Olivia looked at the tarmac. "What made you think of her?" she said. "You went back into the building," he said. "Twice. For people you didn't know." He paused. "Vance would have done that." She didn't say anything. "I just thought you should know," he said, "that some of us saw it, all of it, from the beginning." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, not at her, which was why she let herself be briefly, privately moved by what he'd said, because he wasn't watching for her reaction. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. They sat in the shade for another minute. Then he stood carefully, protecting his arm, and walked back toward the base. Numb. Carver was alone in Conference Room B when Olivia came back at 1600. The rest of Reyes's team had dispersed to various points of the ongoing investigation. Reyes himself was in a phone call down the corridor that had been going on for the better part of an hour. The room was quieter than it had been this morning, the kind of afternoon quiet that follows an acute event, when everything that needed to happen urgently has happened, and what remains is the less dramatic work of consequence. Carver had the tablet. She also had 2 cups of coffee, one of which she pushed toward Olivia's seat. Olivia sat. She looked at the coffee, decided it was probably not any worse than the machine coffee she'd been drinking all day, and drank some of it. "The investigation," she said. "Yes," Carver said. "You said Kane isn't the top of it." "Kane is one operational node. He ran the Fort Calloway piece and had oversight of 2 other installations in the network. The materials he was moving were going to 3 destinations, 2 domestic, 1 international. The international destination is the part that makes this a federal matter above and beyond the military corruption charges." "How many nodes in the network?" "That we've confirmed? 6 installations across 3 commands." "That we suspect?" Carver paused. "More." Olivia turned her cup in her hands. "And the people above Kane?" 2 confirmed. At least 1 more suspected. The confirmed 2 are significant. Senior enough that their exposure creates significant institutional disruption. She said it without drama, which made it land harder. Significant was doing a lot of work in that sentence. "That's why the motion this morning," Olivia said. "It wasn't just Kane protecting Kane. Someone told him to file it." "Someone told his attorney to file it," Carver said. "Yes." which means they know about the investigation, which means they've known for some time and have been managing their exposure carefully. She held Olivia's gaze. Which is why we need to move quickly, and why I need people I trust operating in environments that are close to the remaining nodes. Olivia set down her coffee cup. You want to put me somewhere, she said. I want to offer you a role, Carver said. In a capacity consistent with your actual qualifications, not your coverage designation. The role would be formal, documented, authorized, with your full service record reinstated and active. Olivia looked at her. The afternoon light through the narrow window was long and flat and turned the room a particular color that reminded her of other rooms, in other buildings, in other countries, where she'd sat across a table from someone who was offering her something that would require her to stop being quiet. You're describing bringing me back in, she said. I'm describing giving you the option, Carver said. The work we're looking at is medical in its cover and operational in its function. The kind of thing that requires someone who can move through a medical environment with genuine clinical credibility and simultaneously understand what they're looking at when the logistics don't add up. Like a nurse who notices that IV fluids are being rerouted, Olivia said. Like exactly that. She looked at her hands. I built a quiet life, she said. It took me a long time to build it. I know, Carver said. And she did know. Olivia could hear it. Not performance. Not a negotiating tactic. She knew, and she was asking anyway, because people who do the work Carver does have to ask anyway. I need to think, Olivia said. You have time, Carver said. The immediate crisis is resolved. The investigation has what it needs from Fort Calloway. She paused. But not unlimited time. Olivia nodded. She stood. She was almost at the door when Carver spoke again. One more thing, she said. Olivia turned. Carver had the tablet again. She turned it toward Olivia. On the screen was a document, not the investigation file from this morning. Something different, a commendation record. Olivia could see her own name at the top, and below it a citation she had never been permitted to read in full, because the citation itself had been classified at issuance. The classification on your commendations is being lifted, Carver said. Effective tomorrow. It will be part of the public record. She paused. I thought you should see it before that happens. Olivia stood in the doorway and read the citation. She read about a combat operation in a location described by coordinates rather than name. She read about a 12-hour period in which a combat medic, her designation, not her name, had provided surgical-level trauma care to 23 wounded personnel under direct fire using equipment salvaged from 2 disabled vehicles without evacuation support, with 2 other medics incapacitated in the first hour. She read the outcomes. 23 personnel entered that period wounded. 23 survived it. She read the language of the commendation at the end, which had been written by someone who was not a writer, but who had been trying, in the compressed language of official documents, to say something true. Demonstrated under extreme conditions, the particular form of courage that operates without an audience and produces results that exceed the reasonable expectations of available resources and training, recommended for recognition at the highest level available within this classification tier. She looked at it for a long moment. Thank you, she said. She walked out. At 1800, something happened that nobody had formally arranged. The soldiers who had been treated that morning, the ones who were ambulatory, the ones who had been discharged from the medical bay and the triage area and were back in their units doing the slow readjustment of people who've been through something and are now in the same base that looks mostly the same but feels different. They gathered, without coordination, near the eastern tarmac. Not a crowd. 15, maybe 18 people. Okafor was there. The soldier whose tourniquet she'd applied was there, walking with a slight stiffness, but walking. 2 of the walking wounded from the south side of the depot were there. Brand and Callies were there. Herrera was there, standing a little apart from the group with the look of someone who'd helped organize it, but felt strange taking credit for it. Yuen was there. She'd heard about what had happened across the morning, and she'd come to the tarmac because she didn't know what else to do with the feeling. When Olivia crossed the tarmac toward the medical bay for the final supply count handoff, she saw them and stopped. Nobody made a speech. This was not that kind of moment, and these were not that kind of people, and she would have walked away from a speech, and somehow the people gathered there understood that without being told. The soldier with the tourniquet on his leg just nodded at her. Once. The direct kind of nod that means something. A few others did the same. Okafor, standing at the edge of the group, raised his good hand in a brief, informal salute. Not parade ground sharp, not ironic, just acknowledgement. The real kind. She looked at them for a moment. 18 people in the long Nevada light, on a tarmac that smelled of smoke and desert, and the particular mixture of fuel and effort that is the persistent smell of military installations everywhere. She nodded back. Once. The same kind. Then she kept walking, because the supply count wasn't going to do itself. Herrera fell into step beside her. "You knew they were there," he said. "I saw them when I came around the corner," she said. "Does it—" He stopped. "Does it matter to you that they came?" She considered this honestly. "Yes," she said. "It matters." She glanced at him. "Not because I needed it, because they chose to do it, and that choice says something about them." He walked beside her in silence for a moment. "What does it say?" he said. "It says they're the kind of people who show up for things," she said. "That's rare, and it's the thing that actually holds a unit together." He nodded, absorbing that. They reached the medical bay. She pushed open the door. The supply shelf was exactly as it had been at 04:45 that morning, when she'd done the final inventory before the explosion had changed the shape of the day. She picked up the clipboard. "I'll do it with you," Herrera said. She handed him the second clipboard without comment. They were midway through the count when Reyes appeared in the doorway. He had the look of someone who had just finished a long phone call and had something to say that was going to change the shape of something else. "Olivia," he said. She looked up from the clipboard. "The investigation just made its first upstream move," he said. "One of the two confirmed senior figures, he got ahead of it, turned himself into federal authorities 40 minutes ago. He's agreed to full cooperation." He paused. "His testimony is going to expose the second confirmed figure and expand the map of the suspected network significantly." She processed that. "How significantly?" "The second figure," Reyes said carefully, "has connections to 3 procurement contracts that touched 14 installations. When that becomes public, it will break the whole thing open," she said. "Yes." She looked at the supply shelf. She looked at the clipboard. She thought about the network of people who had been quietly moving things, supplies, equipment, materials, through the bones of military infrastructure, using the logistics that were supposed to sustain soldiers as a mechanism for personal profit, and the way that the whole thing had been invisible until a nurse who ran in the mornings had seen a convoy at 05:30 and written down a number. "When does it go public?" she said. "The federal announcement is scheduled for 0900 tomorrow," Reyes said. "It'll name names, it'll name the installation, it'll—" He stopped. He looked at her with the particular expression she'd seen on his face a few times today. Something between assessment and something more complicated. "What?" she said. "It'll name you," he said. "Your role in identifying the network. Your documentation. The investigation is going to credit a medical professional at Fort Calloway. And with the classification lift on your record coming tomorrow, your name will be attached to the full picture by midday." She looked at him. "Your quiet life," he said. "Not cruel, just accurate." She set down the clipboard. The medical bay was silent except for the hum of the refrigeration unit near the back wall, which had been humming the same way for 6 weeks and would continue humming after she was gone, because refrigeration units did not care about federal investigations. "How public?" she said. Reyes opened his mouth to answer. His phone rang. He looked at it. Something crossed his face. A micro-expression, contained almost instantly, but she caught it. "Carver," he said. He answered it. He listened for 11 seconds. She counted. He lowered the phone slowly. "The second figure," he said. "The one who hasn't turned himself in." He looked at her, and now his expression was unreadable in the specific way of someone managing information that requires very careful delivery. "He just filed an emergency legal motion. His attorney is claiming that the Fort Calloway evidence chain—" He paused. She waited. "Was deliberately manufactured," he said. "He's not challenging the documentation procedure." He's claiming the documentation was planted, that someone with prior knowledge of the investigation placed a manifest number in the medical bay log as a setup. He looked at her. He's naming you as a federal operative who was embedded at Fort Calloway, specifically to create a false evidence trail. The refrigeration unit hummed. Herrera stared at Reyes. She stood very still. The argument was elegant, in the particular vicious way of legal arguments designed to take the truth and turn it inside out. She had concealed her background. She had maintained a civilian appearance while holding a classified military record. She had documented a manifest number that happened to be the precise piece of evidence needed to activate a federal investigation. And she had done all of this while serving at the installation of the man being investigated. She had not done any of it deliberately in the service of the investigation. She had not known about the investigation. She had simply been a nurse who ran in the mornings and wrote things down. But from the outside, from the vantage point of a defense attorney building an argument, she could see exactly how it looked. "They're going to make me the story," she said. Reyes didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The evidence that had taken Kane down. The evidence that was unwinding a 14-installation procurement network. All of it traced to her hands, her log, her name. And now someone at the top of that network was going to try to make those hands suspect. She picked the clipboard back up. "Then we need to prove they're wrong," she said. Herrera looked at her. "How?" She looked at the supply shelf, at the organized, precise, undramatic documentation of what was present and what was missing and what had been there before and wasn't anymore. The record of 6 weeks of careful attention. "We start," she said, "with everything I wrote down before I ever knew what I was looking at." The medical bay maintenance log had 41 entries over 6 weeks. Olivia knew this without counting because she had written every one of them, and she had a specific memory of each. Not the words exactly, but the moment that produced them. The Tuesday morning when the crash cart battery showed low charge. The Friday when the sterile dressing count didn't match the previous week's usage. The date and time and manifest number of a supply discrepancy that she had written down the way she wrote down everything. Factually, without interpretation, in the margins of a record she expected nobody to read carefully. She spread the log across the exam table in the medical bay and went through it from the beginning. Reyes pulled a chair to the end of the table. He did not offer to help or take over. He sat, and he watched, and he understood, she thought, that what she was doing was not something he could assist with, that the value of what she was building came from her being the one who built it. Herrera stood near the door. He'd offered to leave. She'd told him to stay. What she was doing was constructing a timeline of ordinary attention. The first supply entry was dated 4 days after her arrival. A notation that the wound closure strips were stocked at 60% of recommended inventory. Nothing dramatic, a gap. The kind of gap that accumulates when supply deliveries aren't fully matched against usage, or when something that was ordered never quite arrived. She'd noted it. She'd submitted a routine requisition the same day. The requisition had been partially filled. She'd noted that too. She went forward through the log, and what emerged, entry by entry, date by date, was a picture of a supply chain that had been bleeding quietly for months before she arrived. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have triggered any single alarm. Small shortfalls, partial fulfillments, items marked as delivered that arrived at 60 or 70% of the ordered quantity. A pattern that you would only see if you were the kind of person who documented everything, who never assumed that a gap in 1 week would correct itself automatically the next, who wrote things down not because she expected anyone to read it, but because the record was the record. The manifest number she'd logged 3 days before her removal order was entry 38 of 41. It was not the most significant entry in the log. It was the entry that had a number Reyes's investigation recognized, but it was surrounded by 37 entries that told the same story in smaller increments, across 6 weeks, beginning before she could possibly have known anything about any federal investigation. She looked up at Reyes. "This log starts on my 4th day," she said. "The pattern of discrepancies starts on my 4th day because that's when I first had enough baseline data to identify a discrepancy. The investigation has been running 93 days. I didn't arrive at this installation until 42 days ago." "I know," he said. "So the argument that I was embedded here to manufacture evidence requires a timeline in which I was inserted into this assignment 51 days after the investigation began." in a temporary coverage role caused by a genuine injury to a specific physician that was arranged through standard military medical assignment channels. She held his gaze. They'll know that's not a plausible insertion scenario the second anyone looks at my assignment paperwork. They know, Reyes said. The motion isn't about what's plausible. It's about what creates enough noise to delay the upstream processing. Every day they buy, the second figure's attorneys are moving assets, negotiating position, building distance between him and the documented evidence. He paused. But you're right. The timeline collapses the argument. We just need to get it in front of the right people before it takes root. Carver, she said. Already on it, he said. He stood. He looked at the log spread across the table. May I take this? She looked at it. 41 entries. 6 weeks of early mornings and supply counts and writing things down in the particular silence of a medical bay at 0600 when no one else was around. It was not dramatic documentation. It was not the record of someone who had been building a case. It was the record of someone who could not stop paying attention even when no one was asking her to. Yes, she said. He picked it up with the care of someone who understood what it was. He left. She looked at the empty exam table for a moment. Then she went to restock the wound closure strips, because the inventory was still short, and someone was going to need them eventually, and that was the work that was in front of her. The second figure's legal motion was denied at 7:43 the following morning. The denial came from a federal judge in the district court and was 6 pages long, which was more than most such motions received. The extra pages were not extensions of mercy, but of specificity, working through the timeline argument with the methodical attention of someone who found the original claim not just insufficient, but instructive in its insufficiency. The phrasing in the third page was later described by a legal journalist covering the case as the kind of language a judge uses when they want the record to reflect exactly how thin this was. Olivia was in the base cafeteria when Reyes texted her. She read the message, drank the rest of her coffee, and looked out the window at the Nevada morning, pale and bright, and already getting hot. The second figure, a senior procurement officer named Aldis, who had spent 19 years building a career on the careful management of other people's trust, surrendered to federal authorities at 0831. He did not have the composure that Kane had shown during processing. He was, by several accounts from people present, not composed at all. He had believed until the last possible moment that the motion would hold, that the noise would be enough, that a woman in a temporary medical posting could be made to look like something she wasn't by someone with enough legal resources and enough time. He had not counted on 41 entries of ordinary, dated, factual documentation that began 51 days before he became relevant to her story. He had not counted on the kind of person who writes things down, not because she expects to need them, but because the record is the record. The federal announcement came at 0900 as scheduled. It named the installation. It named Kane. It named Aldis and the second senior figure who had also, in the hours between the motion's denial and the morning's announcement, concluded that cooperation was the only position available to him. It named the shell contractors, the falsified manifests, the 14 installations, the 3 procurement contracts. It named the international destination that had made this a federal matter above and beyond military corruption, a detail that, when it reached public reporting, would be significantly larger news than anyone at Fort Calloway had understood they were sitting in the middle of. And it named Olivia Marsh, not as a suspect, not as a federal operative, as a medical professional whose routine documentation of supply discrepancies had provided the evidence link that broke the network's operational security and activated a 93-day federal investigation's final phase. The announcement also noted in its third paragraph that her full service record had been declassified effective that morning and was being entered into the public record, including 3 commendations for her actions during a classified combat operation and a combat medical qualification rating that placed her in the top tier of her field. She read the announcement on her phone, sitting on the concrete barrier near the tarmac, in the shade, where she had apparently been doing a significant amount of her thinking lately. The morning was quiet in the specific way that follows several consecutive days of the opposite of quiet. The depot skeleton was still there. It would take weeks to fully clear, but the active investigation equipment had been largely packed and the additional vehicles had left, and Fort Calloway was returning to the particular rhythm of a base doing its ordinary work. Herrera came and sat beside her. He had a cup of coffee for her, which he handed over without comment. She took it. "It's everywhere," he said. "Every outlet. Your name is everywhere." "I know," she said. "How do you feel about that?" She considered the question honestly, the way he'd come to expect from her. "Strange," she said. "I spent a long time being invisible on purpose. It wasn't because I was ashamed of anything. It was because invisible was easier." She turned the cup in her hands. Easier is not the same as better. He was quiet for a moment. "What happens now?" "For you," she said, "you keep doing what you did yesterday. You document everything. You push back on supply discrepancies. You trust your reads on patients and stop second-guessing them in the moment." She looked at him. "You're a good medic, Herrera. Stop waiting for someone to confirm that." He looked at the tarmac. "That's not what I meant." "I know it isn't," she said. She had not told anyone about Carver's offer. She had not decided about it, which meant she had also not told Reyes, who she suspected already knew she hadn't decided and was giving her the space to make the decision in her own time. She understood that about him now. He had the patience of someone who had worked long enough with people under pressure to know that the most important decisions needed the most room, not the least. She thought about the quiet life. She thought about coverage positions, about 4-week postings that stretched to 6, about perimeter roads in the early morning and the particular freedom of moving through a place without being known by it. There was something real in that. She had not been pretending when she'd built it. She had also not been fully using what she was. And there was a difference she had learned again yesterday. In a burned building, in a surgery suite, in an exam table covered in 41 pages of careful, ordinary record-keeping, between the kind of strength that protects itself by staying hidden and the kind that does the most good by being seen. She wasn't sure she'd found that line yet. She thought she might be closer to it than she'd been yesterday. Voss called a full base assembly at 1100. He had not announced it as anything in particular. He'd issued it through standard channels as a general formation, and the base had assembled on the parade ground the way it assembled for any general formation, with the specific organized controlled chaos of several hundred people moving to positions they knew well, the NCOs sorting the edges, the officers finding the front, the junior enlisted filling the rows behind. Olivia stood at the edge of the parade ground, not in formation. She was not sure she was supposed to be part of this. Doran came and stood beside her. "He asked if you'd be here," Doran said. "What did you tell him?" "I said I'd pass the message," Doran said. Olivia looked at the assembled base. The morning light was full and hard and made everything look very clean and very flat the way desert light does, erasing shadow. The depot skeleton was visible from the parade ground, past the eastern perimeter, still trailing a thin thread of something from one of its remaining structures. The concrete beneath her feet had a crack in it that she'd noticed in her first week and had been noticing ever since. She stayed. Voss stood in front of the formation with the bearing of a man who had spent a difficult 24 hours deciding what kind of officer he was going to be going forward. She had seen that decision being made, in pieces, across the day. In his office, at the triage area, in the medical bay doorway where he'd stood and watched her and Herrera do the supply count without saying anything, as if he was trying to understand something by watching it rather than asking about it. He was not a bad man. She had not decided he was. He had made bad decisions under pressure, which was a different thing, and the difference mattered. "Yesterday," he said, without preamble, his voice carrying across the formation in the practiced register of long command, this base experienced an event that tested it. The event itself, the explosion, the casualties, the fire, was the result of criminal activity that had been occurring on this installation for over a year. I was the commanding officer during that period. I did not see it. The formation was very still. This was not the kind of address that bases received routinely. I also, he said, signed a removal order for the individual who did. He paused. That order was based on information given to me by the individual now in federal custody. I did not verify it sufficiently. I acted on the authority of someone I trusted and did not ask the questions I should have asked. He looked out across the rows. That is a failure of command judgment, and I own it. Nobody moved. The woman who identified the supply irregularities that broke this network open is a combat-trained medical professional with a service record that exceeds the qualifications I was told she had. She was on this base for 6 weeks. She saved 11 lives yesterday, including 2 soldiers she physically extracted from a burning structure and one she kept alive on an operating table that wasn't designed for what she did on it. He paused again. I tried to send her away. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people absorbing something real. Olivia Marsh, Voss said, and his voice had something in it that hadn't been there when he'd said her name before. Not as a title, not as a designation, just her name, plain, given its full weight, is one of the best people who has served at this installation. She is also a reminder that the way someone enters a room, the title they carry, the rank they wear or don't wear, tells you almost nothing about what they're capable of. The record does. He looked toward the edge of the parade ground. We should have read the record. She stood at the edge of the parade ground and she looked at the ground and she breathed steadily because she was not going to come apart in front of 300 soldiers, and she had enough control of herself to manage that. Even now, even when what she actually wanted was to be somewhere private where nobody was watching and she could let the morning catch up to her. Then Okafor started it. From his position in the formation, his arm still in the sling, he started a slow, sustained applause that had nothing performative in it, the kind that comes from a body that is doing it because the body decided to, before the mind caught up. The formation picked it up, not instantly, person by person, row by row, the way things spread when they're genuine rather than coordinated, unevenly, with gaps, with a few people who were still deciding and then decided, with the particular sound of several hundred people who all arrived at the same conclusion from their own direction. She looked up. She did not smile, exactly. There was something in her face that was not the performance of emotion, but emotion itself, the unmanaged kind that comes out in the lines around the eyes and the set of the jaw. She let it be there. She had learned, slowly and against her own instincts, that letting things be seen is not the same as losing control of them. She stood straight. She nodded once, the same nod she'd given on the tarmac yesterday, the real kind, the one that means I see you seeing me without making more of it than it was. The applause continued for a moment. Then Voss dismissed the formation, and the ordinary sounds of the bass returning to work replaced it, and it was over. Doran exhaled beside her. Okay, Doran said quietly, to no one in particular. She called Carver at 1400 from her quarters, where she'd gone to sit in a room that was still clean and still ordered and would have to be vacated again soon. I'll do it, she said. The role. The work. Carver was quiet for 1 second. What changed your mind? Nothing changed my mind, Olivia said. I needed time to find it. Carver understood the distinction. There are conditions I want to talk through before anything is formalized. There are conditions on my side too, Olivia said. I assumed there would be, Carver said. Next week, in person. Yes, Olivia said. She ended the call. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the room with the duffel still by the door. She hadn't unpacked it, because she hadn't known until now that there was a reason to decide differently about where she was going. And she looked at it. Then she put it in the closet. Not permanently, just not by the door anymore. The court-martial proceedings against Kane began 6 weeks later and concluded in 11 days. The evidence chain held without structural challenge. The legal motion was referenced in the proceedings as an example of the kind of delay tactic that fails when the underlying documentation is rigorous enough to survive scrutiny from every angle. It was referenced specifically, and Kane's attorney did not enjoy that portion of the proceedings. Kane was convicted on 9 counts: corruption, theft of government property, falsification of military records, conspiracy, and 4 counts related to the endangerment of military personnel. 1 count for each soldier whose injuries were directly attributable to the conditions created by his unauthorized convoy movement in the dark at 0530. He was stripped of rank in a proceeding that had the specific colorless efficiency of institutional machinery removing what it had mistakenly granted. He was sentenced to federal prison. He did not look at Olivia during the proceedings. She was present as a witness for 4 of the 11 days. She testified to what she had seen, what she had documented, when she had documented it, and why. She did not testify about who she was or what she had done before she arrived at Fort Calloway. Her service record was part of the evidentiary file available to anyone who needed to read it, and that was sufficient. Aldous received a longer sentence than Kane because his position in the network had been higher and his choices had created broader damage. The third figure, the senior officer who had turned himself in on the morning of the announcement, received the reduced exposure that cooperation had bought him, which still meant federal conviction and the permanent loss of the career he had spent 3 decades building. None of them would have been in that courtroom without a manifest number written in the margin of a medical bay maintenance log by a woman who wrote things down because she always had. Herrera was formally commended for his actions during the crisis. The citation specifically noted his management of the field triage under adverse conditions and his decision to document and escalate the supply anomalies in the medical bay's record. He pinned the commendation to the wall of the medical bay above the supply shelf, which was now fully stocked and would remain fully stocked under the revised supply protocol that Voss had implemented within 2 weeks of the crisis. Brandon Callies received unit recognition. Okafor received a formal commendation for his management of the suppression line that had kept the fire from reaching the fuel storage. The citation was short and accurate and meant something. Feist recovered fully. He was back on light duty by the time Kane's proceedings concluded, with a faint scar above his left ear that he would have for the rest of his life, and that he would, eventually, be able to tell the story of. Olivia's new appointment was announced at the end of the month. The title was long, and the official language was dense, as official language tends to be. But what it meant was this: she would lead the development of a cross-command emergency medical training program, field-level, austere environment-focused, built around the specific realities of what combat medics actually encountered rather than what training programs had historically been comfortable modeling. The curriculum would be built from experience rather than theory, and it would be built by people who had the experience to build it rather than the rank to assign it. She was one of those people. She was the lead. She received the appointment without ceremony in Carver's office, in a building she was not going to describe to anyone. She signed the paperwork. She shook Carver's hand. On the way out, she stopped in the corridor. She thought about Sergeant Vance, who she'd never met, Okafor's medic 8 years ago, who had always been right and had died in a training accident before anyone had thought to study what made her right and build a system that preserved it. She thought about all the Vances, all the people who had exactly the knowledge that was needed, whose knowledge lived only in them, whose deaths or departures or quiet removals took the knowledge with them because nobody had thought to ask for it while they had it. She thought about 23 soldiers on a mountain in a country she still couldn't name, who were alive because she had stayed in a position for 12 hours and refused to let the math work out wrong. She thought about a 19-year-old private named Feist, who was alive because she happened to be in a building she'd been ordered to leave, on a morning she'd been scheduled to be gone, because she ran in the mornings and she wrote things down. The work she was being asked to do now was not glamorous. It was curriculum design and training protocols, and the slow institutional work of changing how something was taught, which was the hardest kind of change to make and the most durable once it was made. It would not look like what she'd done in that burning building. It would not feel the same, but more people would know what to do inside the burning building. More people would have the 12-hour capability. More Vances would survive into their second and third postings, and their knowledge would move forward instead of stopping where they stopped. That was worth the paperwork. She walked out of the building into a morning that was overcast for once. Not the Nevada sky she'd been living under for the past 2 months, but an East Coast sky, gray and low and promising something. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. She had a bag with her. Not a duffel, an actual bag, the kind you bring when you're not planning to leave quickly, with more than one change of clothes and a book she'd been meaning to read for 3 years. She had not become a different person. She was not healed, exactly, or resolved, or any of the words that get used when people want to wrap things cleanly. She still had the tremor in her left hand after surgical procedures. She still ran in the mornings. She still found it easier to be invisible than seen, and she suspected that would always be true, and she was no longer certain it needed to change entirely. What she had understood, across 2 months at a base in the Nevada desert, across a removal order and a burning building and a surgical suite and 41 pages of careful ordinary documentation, was something she'd known before and had spent years trying to manage without. The strongest people she had ever known were not strong because they had never been dismissed. They were strong because being dismissed had not stopped them from doing the work. The work was still the work. The patients were still the patients. The manifest number was still the manifest number. You wrote it down because you saw it, not because someone was watching you write it. You ran the perimeter because the perimeter needed to be run. You went back into the building because someone was still in it. You kept your hand steady and you kept going, and eventually, not always, not on a schedule you could predict, the truth of what you'd been doing all along became impossible to ignore. It didn't make it easy. It didn't make the removal orders stop coming or the Canes of the world less certain of themselves. It didn't mean the people who underestimated you would ever fully understand what they'd done. But it meant the work survived, the documentation survived, the 23 soldiers survived and Feist survived, and the network of people who had been quietly draining the life out of something important had been stopped, in the specific way that those things get stopped, not by someone extraordinary arriving from outside, but by someone ordinary doing what she'd always done, in the 4 hours before dawn, without an audience. Olivia Marsh picked up her bag. She looked up at the gray sky. Then she walked toward what came next. She had never needed anyone to see her coming. She only needed to arrive.